Welcome to the People in AI podcast. I'm your host, Karthik Ramakrishnan, co-founder of Armilla AI. Join us as we delve into the AI's latest advances, ethical considerations, and risks in this evolving technology. Now, we've taken nearly a year's hiatus from this podcast, but we are now back in your feeds, dropping an episode every other week. On this first episode for 2024, we have my co-founders at Armilla AI on to discuss all the craziness that has happened in the AI industry since we last published an episode. First on the docket is Dan Adamson, formerly with Microsoft and his own company, Outside IQ, and currently co-founder and CTO at Armilla AI. Dan, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit and share a bit of your background?
Yeah, hey, I'm Dan, and nice. Looking forward to chatting with my fellow workmates today. I think we're going to have some fun discussions here. So thanks for the invite.
Excellent. I know it's a bit odd speaking outside of just meetings and having a more public conversation, but I'm sure we'll get through it. And then second on the docket is Phil Dawson, who leads policy and advisory and all of our risk assessments at Armilla AI. Now, he spent nearly a decade crafting AI policy, collaborating with organizations like the OECD, the World Economic Forum, the UN, and as a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, he's seen a lot in the space of AI and AI regulation and policy. So welcome aboard. Phil, if you want to share a few words about yourself, glad to have you on the show.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And I just want to say that I was really appreciated the introduction as one of your co-founders. Great promotion to start the year. So anyway, really excited to have this conversation about what we saw in 2023 and what's coming ahead. I started my career in AI working at a company called Element AI with Karthik, actually. It was I think in those days, the first wave of AI policies and principles development, the first kind of explosion. We've seen kind of the second wave in the last year. I think we're looking forward to unpack that. So thanks for having me.
Amazing. And Armilla is still a early stage company, which means everyone is a co-founder because we're at the ground level building everything. So not to be seen as anything different. But back to the topic of AI, I think 2023 was a seminal year. We've spent, all three of us have spent more than a decade in the world of artificial intelligence or machine learning or predictive analytics, as it was called before, but really using models to predict various things from business behaviors to user behaviors. And now, finally, it seems like people understand what we've been doing for the last 10 years. And all of it thanks to one single company, I would say, OpenAI, although many have come and continue to exist and will exist, but OpenAI actually really broke open the imagination of everyone, including my mom, as to how AI would actually work. Right? What does it actually mean? And so I think GPT and the productization of GPT as ChatGPT really opened up everyone's mind as to what a general purpose model can do, its capabilities, and its almost human-like quality in the way it interacts with people. That, I think, we have a lot to hand OpenAI to. But in the wake of OpenAI, we've had a tremendous number of companies, foundation model companies, including, all the way from closed source, companies like Anthropic, Cohere, and others, to open source models like Mistral and Facebook's models. So we've seen an explosion of these general purpose models come through. We've seen an explosion in terms of number of use cases where people think they can adopt artificial intelligence. And finally, we've unblocked enterprises from really adopting AI at scale. There was a time when even enterprises understood that AI is something that they needed to have. But I think over the last year, it's accelerated their adoption and timelines for which they need to use AI within the enterprise. So with all of that, I think the tremendous amount of attention that AI has generated, not just in the public sphere, but also in the regulatory and government circles, where regulation of AI is being thought of as well. So I think 2023 is going to go down as the year where AI came onto its own, I think for me, the most surprising thing of everything in that was the kind of capabilities that AI is now exhibiting. There was a time when the thinking was the jobs or the tasks that were at risk were the menial, labor intensive tasks. So more robotic. So even prior to AI, RPA or robotic process automation, so the mundane tasks were the ones that were being automated. And that's how we thought about AI. But what OpenAI has broken up really is the creative aspect of human capability that we didn't think AI could exhibit, or at least not in the near term, but that's one of the first things that has happened. And that has opened up the number of tasks and skills that AI can replicate that we thought could only be done by humans. And that to me is the biggest surprise of all. But Dan, what to you does 2023 represent in the kind of the timeline of AI since you've been in the space?
I don't want to age myself, but definitely this time is a little different. There's been a few, like if you look at the history of AI, there's been a lot of promise and then hype cycle and then winters. And people talk about an AI winter. There were actually a few, right? The last one, Watson popped up and then everyone realized, geez, that's a lot of work to get a very directed result when it beat Jeopardy, right? There's a ton of work that went in to that system. Very, very directed technology at the end of the day, and very hard to convert and generalize. That I think led to the sort of last winter. I was building a startup at the time. We had AI for financial institutions, and our marketing team and sales team came back to me and said, look, you have to stop using that word AI because it's scaring everybody. And, so we had to sort of switch around our terminology and pretend it wasn't AI sometimes. And now we're at a tipping point where I think this time's different for a bunch of reasons. We are seeing this tipping point where a few things are happening. One is that really there's the potential here to create applications that do displace and do create efficiencies, and that's different from different revolutions. To your point about where the displacement occurs, this can happen anywhere from very artistic graphics designers, right? People, creativity where their essence was there, through to very white collar jobs, through to, as we push through with robotics, I think nowhere is safe. If you have kids going to college and they ask where they should be directing their focus, the answer is not clear, right? It used to be computer programming, right? CS work, and for example, would be very safe. I don't, that's definitely not safe anymore. So this is different for a bunch of reasons. I think we're past that tipping point where we're past just the hype cycle. There's real change. So it's exciting on the one hand, and it's scary on the other hand too.
Kids trying to figure out entering university this year, wondering where they should be going, or if they'll be called out, whether their work was GPT driven or original in its own way. So, Phil, what's your experience?
I mean, I definitely we've seen some of the same things with just individuals and consumers enjoying the types of new opportunities for productivity and creativity that generative AI can create through free applications or subscription applications. Lots of people using applications like ChatGPT or Claude or other similar agents as part of their work, and companies encouraging individuals to do that, to transform productivity and actually building that into some of their workflows. So I think, not only at the consumer level, but the individual level in enterprises, for sure, we've seen a lot of adoption of AI, unlike any other year prior. And as Dan said, I was thinking what Dan was saying about some of the white collar professions or the professions that rely on a lot of reading and text analysis and drafting and summarization. Some of the work that we've done at the company with in legal tech makes me think that I might have actually stayed practicing law if some of this had existed 10 years ago. So much manual work is done by professionals, whether it's lawyers or accountants or banking. So I think the technologies really began to improve the quality of these jobs. Of course, there could be impacts on the labor force, and that's something that's been pointed out in recent reports by the IMF that came out a week ago. It was in our newsletter. Another thing I think that was true in the first half of 2023 is people really did focus on consumer adoption and individual adoption. And there was this whole narrative that enterprises were not actually using generative AI. It was too risky, and enterprise adoption was still very minimal. I think that's changed in the last 3 to 6 months from our own conversations as a company, just reading the news, and then I've heard some people refer to some of the revenue projections of companies like Anthropic, others. Anthropic, recently it was reported that Anthropic anticipates $850 million in revenue in 2024. So, if anything, that is a testament to what enterprise adoption or interest in adoption, at least, and maybe there's a distinction between purchasing and subscribing and how much is being used. But certainly it's, I think, trending towards enterprises looking to use the technology at scale as well.
I think that's a good segue, though, too, right? Like there's a lot of that adoption right now is, some testing by enterprises for sure, a lot of dipping your toes in the water, but there's also it feels like a bit of an arms race component to it. And we're seeing a lot, and we can circle back, I'm sure, on some fun examples of when folks are moving too fast. And we're also seeing a lot of pressure now, I think, unlike any other time, and this sort of heated up during the course of 2023 around regulation and thinking about regulation here, right? And I don't know, Karthik, if you want to say a few words about what you're seeing there, and Phil, I know, has the pulse, his finger on the pulse for sure.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think we've seen more happen in the world of AI regulation than any other time. I would say AI safety, responsible development, accountability of development of these models has come on its own. It's become mainstream rather than a fringe group speaking to their colleagues saying, look, we need to do this properly, versus now the government, they're able to influence governments, right? There's think tanks, there's working groups within the Congress, within the White House, within the EU, within Canada, within UK, all thinking about this. And that's just the Western Hemisphere, a lot going on in the Eastern Hemisphere too. So I think there's a lot going on, and we can do a rundown, but really for me, it's the fact that AI safety and AI risks are becoming top of mind. And we're seeing real examples of these issues come through, right? Where we're also seeing some sort of contention is what do we focus on in terms of regulation? I think that's the challenge that 2024 will be about. Is it about what do we regulate and how do we regulate? I think the intention to regulate in some way, shape, or form is there, but I think we have to go back to the fundamental question of why we want to regulate, and therefore what we want to regulate. But before we get to that, maybe Phil, do you want to give us a rundown of sort of the landscape of regulation that's going on around the world?
Sure, and maybe just as I get into that, I think there's an important. I think 2023 saw a convergence of several different approaches to conceptualizing the governance of AI and then ultimately its regulation. If you think back a few years ago, everybody was talking about ethical AI and principles to help, guide the responsible and beneficial development of AI so that it could be used for good and for progress and both social and economic progress. At the same time, particularly in the EU, there was this concept of trustworthy AI and initial guidelines to develop AI products and organizational governance frameworks to ensure that products were developed in a way that they could be trusted. we also had responsible AI kind of emerge as this kind of catch-all term for how organizations should develop their policies and practices, and also product level governance to ensure that they're respecting different rules and producing trustworthy models. And I think in 2023, all of this kind of converged with the narrative around AI safety and existential risk into the don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but into AI risk management, kind of the lowest common denominators. However you come at AI, whether you're trying to develop responsible AI, ethical AI, safe AI, trustworthy AI, at the end of the day, your responsibility is to identify and mitigate some of these risks across the organization, cross-functional teams, product teams, and yeah.
In that front, right? Like, I think I just want to double click on something you just said, right? With that big disconnect today in terms of what needs to be regulated. Are we regulating future AI, which is going to kill us all type concept, and therefore it needs to be controlled, versus the safety of the public today, right? I.e., we have a technology that can run amok and can influence or in a very negative format without even getting sentient, can destroy the fabric of our society. So we don't even need the AI to do that. We can leverage this AI as a tool to do that ourselves. So in that spectrum, where do we land?
Yeah, I think today we're seeing it, at least in regulation, a lot of the approaches being taken are more designed to address short and medium term risks. If you think of the EU AI Act, which there's a lot of debate about in 2023, much like in 2022, and which we expect to pass early this year or later this year, it's a risk-based approach to protecting individuals from health, safety, and human rights risks of AI deployment across different industries, largely relying on assessments to categorize the risk and requiring companies to take certain steps to test and validate models, to document data sets, model design and specifications, and some reporting obligations as well. So I think in the EU and elsewhere, regulators are beginning to focus on issues that matter to individuals and businesses today. But at the same time, some of the provisions related to foundation and general purpose AI that were added in the last 6 months or so, I think at least the objectives are to address some of the mid or longer term or unforeseeable risks that we might not be able to understand today, but through some transparency and reporting requirements for those models.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think the EU AI Act was certainly derailed a little bit in the beginning of 2023 with the discovery or the adoption of generative AI. I think we started with Italy banning it outright, and I think Spain banned it outright until OpenAI addressed some of those privacy concerns they had. And we came to a conclusion. One question for you, Phil, yes or no type question. Do you think the EU AI Act will become law this year?
Yeah, I think it absolutely will, and we've seen recently at least a version of the text leak, and has been widely discussed. There was the conclusion of the trilogue debates in December, so a compromise agreement was reached. So I think almost all the barriers related to adoption of the act this year have been overcome. I think we'll definitely see it. We'll definitely see it in 2024. And it may take some time before enforcement occurs, but the act will come into force this year, that's for sure.
Cool. And switching gears, coming stateside, we've seen the Canadian AI Act, a draft of that was released, maybe not last year, but the year before that. And then you've got, but more interestingly, the American or the United States pushing through the executive order from the White House. We've got the Congress conducting a lot of hearings to understand the scope of where AI is. And that's where we've seen the spectrum from, the excels and the decels competing with each other on what should be regulated or what aspect of AI should be regulated. But Dan, any thoughts on how these regulations will actually have an impact in 2024. Do they have teeth to actually have an impact?
Well, I think what we've seen is, we started the EU AI Act is actually a good example where they started to say, look, we're going to try to write something a little forward looking. It's going to be based around use cases and harms and definitions of high impact, and we won't have to rewrite this. And then generative AI came along, right? So and then there was a question of how do we adapt to that? And I think the jury's still out. I think the answer is these are different types of harms that we have to look at on different timescales. And so when you ask, will they have teeth? I think it's very, very easy to take something like a GDPR and have an equivalent of that, like the AI Act that's I guess close to the final version, and have teeth with fines and with a sort of quote unquote police authority that has the capability to look at these systems. So I think there will be teeth. I think it will be geared towards harms that we see today, harms around bias, harms around individuals. I think that it will be very clear over the next year around where liabilities fall, around issues that are currently pending in some lawsuits about other acts, other lawsuits. So there's going to be a legal side to this too, where individuals who have experienced harms will be working their way through the courts with their claims. And I think we're going to end up in a place where we can look at and understand those risks and understand and have teeth behind the regulations, and there might require some updates. There's talk about updating copyright law around AI and ownership and things like that. So there might be some evolution of legislation, and there might be evolution by court rulings happening that might go all the way to the Supreme Court. But I think that for those types of harms, there will be sufficient teeth. Where I'm a bit worried is that second part. I think we need to start thinking about that. I don't think we're prepared, but I think it's a different sort of system or framework that we need around those existential risks and that side of it. And I think we need to put attention into that. I think we need to put R&D dollars into that, and that's something that needs focus. And I don't think we should conflate the two either. And I think that's what's happening, and it's just causing a lot of muddling. It's different timescales, it's different levels of risk, and it's different harms. And so let's get some of these initiatives like the EU AI Act, let's see them play out a bit, and let's pay attention on a different time scale to those other potential harms.
I think that's absolutely right. I think the focus on existential kind of futuristic risk to the current scenarios, I think needs to be really well thought out. I can't help but think that regulation of models, or the regulatory structure, is not new. We're just trying to apply it to a new technology. And I think that's what we're forgetting in all of this conversation between each other. And not just in this conversation, but externally as well. The financial regulatory authorities in different countries, the insurance regulatory authorities have been around for a very long time, thinking about things like the Fair Lending Act, the Equal Opportunity Act, and we understand what harms we want to protect society against. Now, all we're trying to do is how do you ensure that these models are also come under that regulatory regime? And just because this technology is new and it's really taking our imaginations by storm, I think we're losing sight of the fact that this regulation is not new. It's just being applied to a new technology. A. B, how it's applied is a bit complicated. Fine, because the technology is a bit more complicated. It's non-deterministic. That means it's not being probabilistic nature, you actually are not entirely sure where this issue is going to come from. And so I think that creates that level of uncertainty as to how we regulate. But let's not conflate it with the fact that, this is a brand new regulation. The constructs of what we're trying to regulate are the same. The second part B to that is I like actually what the US is doing, or the Congress or the White House is thinking about, which is having the individual regulatory authorities be responsible for regulating models within their domain. I think which is a much more practical way to approach it, i.e. existing regulatory regimes without creating new regimes, having them efficiently expand their scope to include AI. And I think that's a much more pragmatic way to go about it, which solves the problem for today. And then maybe Congress should then focus on existential risk. I don't know. But I think that's where we are. Now, a lot happened in the world of AI gone wrong, right? We've had rogue AIs all over the place. And when I mean rogue AIs, I think just AI things, getting things, just badly. And I know at least one case or two cases, most recently, we had Cigna, which I think was sued for using an AI model for discriminating against elderly patients. Now, what they did was override a doctor's recommendation on whether a treatment was mandatory or required or not, and let the AI decide and override the doctor's decision. In which case, the model made the decision to override and said, well, we are not going to honor that claim because that was not a necessary procedure. This has resulted in a class action lawsuit against that team. Now, there's three things happening here. We may call that an AI issue. Actually, there's three dimensions, and I think many of these cases can be broken down into that. But I just want to set this up, right? A, did the model get it wrong? So something a doctor would have prescribed in the past, but now the model calling it wrong. Is that a wrong decision, or was it just the scope of data that was trained on? So that is an inaccuracy, or was it the model performing under the constraints of, under the constraints of what was developed on? Second, there's the whole concept of human in the loop that we keep talking about in AI. So how do we catch the bad decisions from AI? Let's put humans in the loop. One has to wonder whether humans in this loop were, right? So did that process that most developers of AI models rely on to catch faulty predictions, that seems to be failing. And third, the explicit decision by an organization to override the human decision with the machine's decision. That's a psychological shift as well in how they're operating. So it's not just AI going wrong. It's the implementation of it, the usage of it, all comes into question in this lawsuit. And so it's going to be interesting to see whether the AI was actually at fault, or was it the way it was implemented that's at fault, right? Of course, the headlines say AI got wrong and the AI is making a bad decision. That's the easy pick, but it's more than that. So first of all, that was one of my most interesting cases of an AI system being blamed for bad decisions. But over to you. What were your favorite one? Maybe we'll start with Dan this time and go back to Phil. Pick one, but there were many, so I think you might have a hard time.
Okay, well, I can group two together, but I agree. Part of the problem here is actually that these models have become more convincing, and so it's easier to just go along with what they suggest. So these decision assist tools are getting more convincing. The hallucinations are more convincing, and so it becomes less of an argument, I think, that they're decision assist tools, right? But that's more, I guess, a philosophical point. For me, the fun ones to me, and I'd group them together, there's a lot of cases now where AI has gone wrong and has caused harms to other parties, but you can see the arms race nature to this with these two examples. Bing Chat, Bing coming out with, Microsoft coming out with their Bing Chat feature, racing it out to market. And I think it was only out a week or so before this New York Times reporter, a dialogue with, maybe even only a few days, Kevin Roose had a dialogue with the chatbot, and you can see it go unhinged right? That's an example where Microsoft probably put this out as part of this arms race and got a lot of buzz off of it, but a lot of it became negative buzz when they saw this devolve and the chatbot proclaiming its love for the reporter and going off the rails a bit and suggesting he divorce his wife, I think. So that's an example, right? That where it's actually self-harm, right? Like you're racing too fast. And to have Google a short while later with their launch kind of repeat themselves, right? They had one or two examples they showed. One was a question someone asked about, the James Webb telescope and it getting that answer wrong, right? And actually using that as one of their examples. And of course, there's when you participate in this arms race and you go fast, there's the potential for a lot of third-party victims, and that's the sad part, and I think why we need to be thoughtful about regulation and why we need to be thoughtful about how this is applied. But the fun ones to me are these sort of self-harm events where I think Google probably lost like $100 billion in market cap overnight, right, because of this example. So I can jest about those because it's cases of self-harm, and I think every enterprise should think about that as they go to deploy these things. How do they get them properly tested with regulation or not? There's the capability to have self-harm and of course harm of others.
I'd have to go with FTC banning Rite Aid from using AI facial recognition technology. The technology was falsely tagging consumers, especially women and people of color, as shoplifters. And unsurprisingly, it looks like they worked with two companies to help create a database of images of individuals. Many of these images were very low quality, coming from security cameras or even employee phone cameras, news stories, like all over the place. And the system generated thousands of false positive matches, according to the FTC. So, I think, this is obviously a huge scale, and with, I think, a technology that has been known to be very inaccurate at identifying persons of color in particular. We've seen coded bias and know of the research supporting it. And yet here we have a recent example of the use of the technology for exactly and failing in exactly those ways that are expected. It also illustrates something what you were saying, Karthik, about existing regulators' mandates and the U.S. regulators in particular, again and again, repeating how deliberate they will be about exercising their regulatory powers, their existing mandates. So here, for instance, the FTC consent order on Rite Aid banned them from using facial recognition technology. That was kind of what grabbed headlines. But it required them to implement a range of other initiatives, from implementing an AI bias monitoring program and a risk assessments to vendor monitoring, to set up a process for addressing consumer complaints and providing notifications to customers in the event of an event, and a manner to contest different actions taken by Rite Aid's use of AI. So, regulators like the FTC have very broad powers, and should they choose to use them, which they seem very keen to do, they'll be very effective at regulating industry and likely will make big waves.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are the interesting cases, right? It's not just a straightforward the AI is at fault, but really it brings into question the broader implementation, application, and usage of these models. I mean, the common denominator is it's causing some harms. But here's something that I think is a bigger issue, which is that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's what we are aware of. How many issues have happened behind the scenes, internally within an organization, that they, maybe it's a revenue issue, right? Someone made a bad decision, and the supply chain was disrupted. We would never hear about that because that's an internal organization's issue, but has big implications for their organization. That's a whole aside, not one that would make the news. So all we hear is, and this is my concern, that all we hear are issues of discrimination. AI is biased, period. Right? And AI is faulty, period. Versus the real issues behind it. I think we have to go a level deeper. I think the media industry, frankly, has to do a better job of trying to understand, because these issues are important. They should be discussed, but let's discuss the right things. I think the favorite one, and I think we should close and move on to the more fun segment. What do we predict for 2024? But we would be remiss not to talk about OpenAI in general and what happened there. I mean, they started as a rocket ship and sort of sputtered in space a little bit, but looks like they're back on track. And what happens to OpenAI is important because obviously they have a huge, they've really brought attention to everything, and they're influencing how enterprises think about AI, how we think about AI, how regulators think about machine learning and these models and their capabilities. So I think that was a big thing in 2023, starting as a B Corp, now moving into a C Corp. The drama with the CEO for some of the largest companies involved, I think was pretty interesting. But the year ended with New York Times suing OpenAI for their copyright issues. So as copyright goes, it's an interesting topic because I think this is going to be fundamental to how AI is trained on in the future. And without the data, we cannot train it. So how this copyright law or how copyright is enforced in the context of OpenAI, and hopefully it doesn't get settled out of court, i.e. OpenAI agrees to pay the sums that New York Times is demanding, which is why we went to court in the first place. And we actually see some conclusion to how copyright should be treated in this case, and clarity for not just developers of models, but also users and the enterprise users of these models, because that's a big risk that we are currently taking on. But on to predictions. Phil, your favorite 3 predictions for 2024?
I predict that we'll have an AI law in Europe. No, that's I've already predicted that. In fact, everybody's predicted that one. I predict that Karthik began to get into this a little bit earlier, but I think that AI and generative AI will play a significant role in the play up to the US elections. It already has, with different candidates using AI for different purposes in their campaigns. But the potential for misinformation, and Karthik, we were discussing this the other day, I think, it is just going to get even more challenging to control as the generative AI and multimodal generative AI makes it possible to produce not only very convincing deepfakes, but audio. I think it's going to be something that comes to a kind of a breaking point this year in the US election, and there could be significant ramifications. So I think I'll start with one and then, see what you guys, I'm not going to, run away with all.
I think that's a good one, actually.
All 3. Yeah.
Yeah. It's okay. Dan, your turn.
I actually, I'll answer at more like a technical level. I think it's going to be interesting to see how things play out over the next year with Gen AI. We're already seeing a bit of a lot of experimentation around what's the best level of specialization for these models. We have models that are becoming very specialized at specific tasks. We have generalized models. We have foundation models that are being fine-tuned to become specialized. We have agents now that act as a layer above that can redirect to different models depending on the task, right? So, hey, I'm going to do some coding and I'm going to do some QA on that, and I might use 2 different models to do that. And then we're starting to also see this sort of mixture of experts as well, where it's actually sort of packaged as one model, but Mistral put out an open source version. There's rumors of OpenAI's models working in this way, where they can start to vote and decide on the best answers or direct to the right pieces or models in a sort of ensemble way. So there's a lot of experimentation about how that's going to, what's the optimal approach there. I think there's a lot of power to that. And I think we're going to see more of that over the next year. And I think we're going to see more advanced solutions along a few of those fronts. And I think just to end with sort of another prediction, we're going to continue to see this battle of open source to closed source. And we'll see how far ahead closed source is versus open source. And if open source is close enough, right, and continues to advance, then it becomes a question of where's the commercialization going to happen. And that's a question maybe over to you, Karthik, right? When we're thinking about this, there's going to be these technical advancements. There's going to be open source where enterprises can start to build their own off of those. Or are we going to see more commercial models generalized through OpenAI, or very specific, vertical models that are commercial, right? And I think we're going to see all of these frictions and all these dynamics over the course of next year play out.
Yeah, if anything, I think I would call out to say that we're going to see a lot more models built in-house. I wouldn't say they're going to overtake bot models, i.e. third-party models being purchased by enterprises. So I'll stick to the enterprise context. Certainly, there's going to be more models built in the generative AI space. And to your point, tying back to the fact, if open source models are as reliable and as capable as some of these closed source models, then we're going to have enterprises questioning themselves. Why buy when I can build something customized, tailored, lightweight, specific, and where I can control some of the risks that are associated with these models? And the tighter I can do that, the more confident I am going to be. And the last 5-6 years, some of the top organizations have been building a considerable, sizable team to do data science. So if we are going all generative AI, which is not the case, by the way, I mean, less than 2% of all models, let's be real also, less than 2% of the models, that's a big number, in the enterprise are generative AI. Generative AI hasn't really gone into production. And we're talking about production models in the enterprise. But let's say that is going to happen, and that is going to happen. I think closed source is going to see a good competition from open source. And if that really happens, then we're going to have those internal teams that have been building these models, other types of models, stretch themselves and leverage these open source capabilities to build models internally. I mean, we're not going to shut down internal data science teams. So I think there's a world where the proportion of dollars spent in building internally versus purchasing may reach parity this year, or maybe even surpass. So that would be my claim. And look, I hope that by the end of 2024, we have resolution to some of these major question marks around copyright, around privacy, and around some of the standards. While regulations are important, these regulations are depending on standards. And there are many standards that are out there that are competing. I'm hoping that the one comes out as a de facto accepted standards across the board. And that would be my wish for 2024, maybe not my prediction, because I think that would make everyone's life a little easier. All right. Well, that was a fun conversation. Thanks for everyone for tuning in, and now looking forward to the next one. Over and out.